All right, well, good morning, everyone. We are here on September the 6th, and we are fortunate to have Eric Choi as our guest speaker. And Eric is someone who has written some fantastic fiction. That's one of the collections is called Just Like Being There. And we will be hearing about that and his topic about science, space exploration, and science fiction. What's unusual, and I'm so happy that he's coming to speak to this, is the public arena, the discourse on science fiction, and not so much science fiction, but on space exploration, because there is a debate all the time going on about that, and that has never been brought up in any of our meetings. So I'm so pleased that he's coming to fill that void. And with that, I will introduce our distinguished speaker, editor, aerospace engineer, I think, and other things aside from science fiction writer, Eric Choi. And I'll stop my slide here.
Gloria, thank you so much, and thank you for this opportunity to speak to the group this morning. I've been following with great interest this particular Zoom series, which I have to confess, before you contacted me, Gloria, was new to me. But now I realize all the great things that I've missed up to this point, and it's a real privilege to be a speaker as part of the series. So let me start perhaps. I know this worked before. Hopefully, the internet infrastructure will be kind to us and this will work again. So is everybody seeing these slides? All right.
Yes.
Great. So thank you so much, everyone, whichever time zone you are around the world, for attending this presentation today. It looks like, just as a cursory view of the participants here, we literally have participants from at least half of the planet Earth, and perhaps even more than that. So I'm very excited and very grateful. So as Gloria said, the topic today is the intersection between science fiction and the real life exploration of space. And this is a topic that is, of course, near and dear to my heart, because I have been greatly privileged in my life to have touched on both of these facets. So I've had a lengthy career in the aerospace sector, worked on a number of space missions. And as Gloria said, I have written science fiction, short fiction, edits some anthologies, including my own collection of short fiction, Just Like Being There, which was published by Springer Nature in 2022. And this opening image, perhaps, of the title slide sort of captures to me, sort of artistically perhaps, that very theme of the intersection between science fiction and the real life exploration of space. So it was from a few years ago, of some artwork from media of the fictional NX-01 Starship Enterprise and the prototype Space Shuttle Enterprise on the left from the 1970s. And I'll actually touch on this a little later in the presentation. I will perhaps start with a caveat that most of this presentation that I'm going to give, I tend to give to a more generalist audience, and certainly not folks like yourselves who are already well versed in science fiction and fantasy and speculative fiction. So obviously for this crowd, there is really no need to define what science fiction and speculative fiction are, except to say that from my standpoint, and perhaps reflecting my background as an engineer myself, I tend to towards gravitate, certainly in both my reading and my writing, towards the more sort of hard SF type of narrative, and sort of that classic definition of that the scientific or technological element in the story is so critical that if you were to remove that element from the story, you really don't have a tale. And perhaps, as I would say to my generalist audience, is one of the earliest examples of that, at least in the Western tradition, is that, of course, of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, that if you can imagine, if the fantastic element were taken out of that story, there's really nothing very interesting going on. Basically, sort of a bored medical student wandering around in Switzerland and having not a very interesting life. And just as an aside, a little bit of self-promotion here. A number of years ago, there was an anthology called We Shall Be Monsters, which commemorated the 200th anniversary of the first publication of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. Joseph McGinty and myself had a story in this collection called a postmodern Prometheus, where we actually discover, in fact, that yes, if you were to take the creature, the monster, the fantastic element out of this, there really isn't much of a story involved. But getting back to the topic of the relationship between space in particular and science fiction, so if we're sort of be hard nosed about it and take the hard science fiction definition that I certainly have a little bit of a preference for, one could perhaps argue that a lot of the mainstream media or Western portrayals of science fiction on television and the movies, things that I very much enjoy, like The Expanse or Star Trek or The Orville or Firefly, these stories could really be put into different milieus. That Star Trek could, many of the same stories arguably could have been told in say like a sailing ship, traversing the oceans and visiting different islands and different planets, no, rather than different planets. Nevertheless, obviously these, despite not perhaps being of the hard science definition that I'm most comfortable with, are certainly all remain compelling stories that inspired me in many ways to enter into the field of STEAM and STEM. And I'll talk a little bit about that later. So, being an engineer, I really can't go on without some kind of a flow chart or a block diagram. So, in thinking about science fiction and its relationship to real world science and the real world exploration of outer space, I sort of came up with this. And as I step through this presentation, I'll talk through each of these blocks. But in general, the way that I've tended to see things is that science fiction or the creation of works of science fiction are influenced by a number of things. So the general attitudes that prevail in society towards science and space and astronomy, for example, our current state of knowledge of the solar system or the wider universe certainly feeds into works of science fiction, as does the general state of science and technology at the moment that a particular work of science fiction could be created. And certainly a number of STEM and STEAM professionals like myself and others have tried their hand at works of science fiction. And in turn, of course, these works of science fiction that are created under these influences themselves, of course, turn around and inspire and influence people to pursue careers in STEAM, as it was in my case. It would also, I would argue, shapes in many ways, for better or for worse, the perceptions of the public in general towards space and astronomy and scientific endeavors. And what's interesting there is that I would argue in some cases those public attitudes could also potentially influence the support, certainly most meaningfully financial support and funding and political considerations for these types of missions. And obviously, with those resources or constraints on those resources and policies have a direct impact on the space missions themselves. So um, starting perhaps with the notion of how attitudes to science in some ways has influenced works of science fiction. And I want to also preface a lot of my comments here that, frankly, due to limitations of my own experience and knowledge base, I will, sort of put a caution that my comments are frankly very Western centric, even very North American centric, and certainly in the Q&A and the discussion, I would be very grateful to hear other perspectives on the things that I'm going to talk about in this presentation. But sort of looking at it again, the sort of Western perspective, the post Second World War perspective, I would argue that in the lead up after the Second World War, there seemed to be a lot of sort of techno optimism that science and technology were the way forward, and that this is, towards the betterment of ultimately of humanity and the lives of, the everyday lives of all of us. And I would argue that over the course of many decades, certainly, as they say, there's there's like a short-term variation in that trend, but so the long-term variation of that trend is, I would argue that I would think that there seems to be a wider skepticism of science and authority and expertise, and that this has consequences. Certainly we saw some of those consequences during the start and the worst of the COVID pandemic, for example. But looking at works of science fiction and those that, for example, deal with space, I could cite works like Blind Sight by Peter Watts, a fine, excellent fellow Canadian writer. And if you're interested in Blind Sight, I cite that in particular because it's actually one of my favorite novels of first contact. And it's because this is a first contact that basically goes completely wrong. Peter is a biologist by background, and what he has portrayed in Blind Sight is because the other, the extraterrestrial, the quotation marks alien, is so far removed from us, from a standpoint of biology, from the standpoint of cognition and other issues, that unlike the very simplistic view of things like Star Trek, for example, we end up having just no basis of communication at all with these particular entities. And another book that had a bit of an influence on me a little more recently is Aurora by Kim Stanley Robinson, which again sort of turns on its head the sort of techno optimism and raises very serious questions about the very notion of so-called space colonization. Basically, everything goes wrong. The ship breaks down. Perhaps a bit of a spoiler that the planet they go to is actually biologically not conducive to human life in a number of ways. There are political schisms, very much a repudiation of sort of the techno optimism that arose in many countries in the West following the Second World War. Of course, as I said earlier, our state of knowledge of the universe at any particular time tends to influence works of science fiction. This is not a literary or written example, but sort of filmmaking or Hollywood filmmaking in the 50s and 60s, portrayals of things like the moon. And so this is a frame, I believe, from a film called Destination Moon, which was trying to figure out. I think this was 1950, and a lot of the artwork for this film was done by the legendary American painter Chesley Bonestell. And so this was the way that the moon was portrayed at that time. And this is actually incorrect. So maybe I'll open it to the crowd, and maybe somebody could maybe suggest to me, what is wrong with this picture of the moon?
The earth is blue, not gray.
Well, that would certainly do it as well. Yeah, the Earth is certainly blue, or at least for the time being, it is. And at least we haven't managed to yet entirely turn it into that sickly sort of greenish, sort of yucky greenish yellow. I was actually thinking about the geology. So you see here that the mountains are very rough, and they're very angular and sharp. And you'll see this as well, and for example, as late as the 1960s in 2001, A Space Odyssey. And it turns out that the moon actually doesn't look like that. The moon actually looks like this. And to our surprise, the mountains of the moon are actually smooth, as we see here. I believe this was the Apollo 15 landing. And the reason for that is while there is no weathering on the moon from the standpoint of sort of like wind or rain and that sort of thing, there is an erosional effect, so something called gardening. And this is basically because of millennia of micrometeoroid and dust bombardment that has actually smoothed out the peaks on the surface of the moon. And this is interesting because, as many of you are unfortunately probably familiar, there are a lot of conspiracy theories about, whether, human beings actually landed on the moon. And so, when that kind of thing comes up, I sometimes point this out and say, well, if the moon landings were faked, why then are the mountains like this and not the way that everybody thought they should have looked? And basically following that kind of discussion, people tend to get a bit confused and they generally leave me alone after that. Another interesting sort of example of the influence of sort of the present societal or contemporaneous societal state of knowledge of the solar system and the universe comes, of course, from Mars exploration. So you go back to the very early works of Edgar Rice Burroughs and the whole Princess of Mars, and portraying this vibrant society and civilization of Barsoom on the planet. Up to H.G. Wells's War of the Worlds, and this advanced yet sort of struggling and dying civilization on Mars, and up to Bradbury's Martian Chronicles, this sort of haunting sort of speculation on it's almost like I find Bradbury almost spiritual, but in all these cases portraying a Mars that has not only life on it but some kind of advanced and sentient life as well. So it really came as a shock when the space age, post 1957 took place, and we started sending spacecraft out there, including to our nearest planetary neighbors, Venus and Mars. And so the first successful flyby of Mars took place in 1965. This was the NASA Mariner 4 spacecraft, and this was the image that one of the images that Mariner 4 took in 1965, showing not the Barsoom of Edgar Rice Burroughs, or the romantic Mars of Ray Bradbury, but something that was quite gray and drab and almost lunar-like, and certainly no canals or fabulous cities to be seen at all. And I would argue that um, this actually killed interest in Mars science fiction for a number of years, probably culminating in the Viking missions in the mid 1970s, which were sent with the express purpose of having astrobiological experiments to try to find evidence of existing or past life on Mars. And the three experiments that were on the Viking landers came up with kind of ambiguous results. And I would argue that really put a damper on Mars exploration. Sorry, not Mars exploration. Actually, Mars exploration, yes, as well. But certainly in terms of science fiction, and it wasn't actually until the mid to late 1990s, almost 20 years after Viking, that the cadence of Mars exploration picked up again. And just as a funny aside, I'm a big fan of the George Pal 1953 version of the War of the Worlds, with these beautiful manta ray fighting machines zapping Los Angeles left, right, and center with those heat rays. But I will point out that there has been payback in terms of the some of the rovers, the Perseverance rover in this case to the right, being equipped with a laser-induced breakdown spectrometer instrument, where technically we are actually zapping Mars as well. So perhaps as a little bit of vengeance or retribution for the Martians toasting Los Angeles in 1953. But getting back to the feedback between the real life exploration of space, gaining knowledge of the planets and the universe, and feeding that into science fiction, what's been really remarkable, sort of from the late 90s to the present day, is the realization in the case of Mars that, well, okay, there's no Barsoom, there's no canals. Bradbury's Martians aren't there, but darn it all, Mars is really an amazing place, even without all that stuff. It's a just an incredible landscape. It's a planet that has the biggest volcano in the solar system, the biggest um, canyon, the Valles Marineris. It's a spectacular place for storytelling, even if there are no, as far as we know, there are no Martians there. And perhaps the sort of prototypical example of that over the last decade or so is Andy Weir's the Martian. Just as an aside, I once saw like a rather funny post about the amount of money it actually took to if they were to actually execute that mission to bring Matt Damon back from Mars was appropriately astronomical. So Gloria mentioned that I am myself an aerospace engineer that writes science fiction, and obviously I'm not the only one. And there's example after example after example. Going back to Arthur C. Clarke in the 40s and 50s, he having a background in as a radio technician. The person with the rather interesting frog there is a fellow Canadian writer, Julie Cherneda, who writes both science fiction and fantasy. She has a biology background. Catherine Asaro, another well-known American writer. She has a doctorate in chemical physics, and very very noteworthy people. In recent years, Liu Kai-shin, most famously for Three Body Problem trilogy, has a computer engineering background, and as another example, David Brin has a background in astronomy and electrical engineering, and obviously the background of myself and all these other examples very much inform the work that they produce. And looking at the flip side of that is there are a lot of scientists, engineers, technicians, mathematicians, artists who obviously through reading watching works of science fiction have been influenced to pursue perhaps scientific or medical careers, or in my case specifically a career in the space program. So in my case, I have to admit it was actually Star Trek that did it. I think one of the first episodes I saw these were in reruns up here in Canada, was Devil in the Dark. I just remember there was some unfortunate person in a red shirt about to be devoured by this acid secreting creature. As a kid, I found that absolutely terrifying, yet strangely compelling. And I think it was that notion of strange new worlds and meeting new life forms that really inspired me to pursue the day job career that I did. But obviously, I'm not the only one. Carl Sagan, the famous astronomer, also, of course, himself a science fiction writer, having written the novel Contact. He and Donna Shirley on the top right there, who was the former manager of the Mars Pathfinder mission, specifically have cited reading works of Bradbury and Edgar Rice Burroughs that got them interested in Mars specifically, but planetary exploration in general. And people like Jack Horner, the paleontologist, Neil deGrasse Tyson, Jane Goodall, Seth Sostak of the SETI Institute have all cited science fiction as being really seminal in launching their interest in scientific and technical careers. And as I said, I can certainly attest to that myself. I'll show a bit of a funny example here as to how pervasive this is, that I see science fiction and sort of geek references in my day job as an engineer all the time. So this is a screen grab from this is probably from about a year and a half ago, but this was actually a NASA solicitation seeking input, like RFI responses for potential extended mission options for the New Horizons spacecraft. So you may remember New Horizons was the first spacecraft to fly by Pluto, and then it went on into, to explore, trans-Neptunian objects, on its way, outbound to the Kuiper Belt. And I couldn't help but notice that in this, very official, NASA RFI solicitation, somebody there was a huge fan of the Orville, as I am, and named all the characters of the Orville in this example table of what was needed as part of this proposal input. So I thought this was just absolutely wonderful and kind of adorable, frankly. Um, so how does science fiction sort of shape or influence perceptions of, space and astronomy in the general public? So I would argue that there are positive and negative elements to that. The positive, I've talked a lot about already. Inspiring people like myself to dream big, to have vision, and ultimately to pursue careers in STEAM fields. And it's some have argued that things like Star Trek have built up interest and support in the real life space program. And Gene Roddenberry himself, the creator of Star Trek, had once written that it was actually his fondest hope that one of the outcomes of Star Trek would be to help people appreciate the importance and the beauty of our current exploration of space. But I think that there are some negative aspects of it as well. And one of them, strangely, is that perhaps it fosters unrealistic expectations of what we can do in space, and in some cases, what we've actually accomplished. So I've had interesting discussions with people who have actually, some of them actually are surprised that what we actually haven't sent people to Mars yet. Like, there's no, moon-based alpha. Like, these things actually don't exist. And, in fact, for the last number of decades, at least from a human spaceflight standpoint, we've been confined largely to low Earth orbit. And there is, in some cases, a risk perhaps that if these endeavors are associated with science fiction or fantastic fiction, that it might trivialize or lessen the seriousness of some of these things. And certainly, I would not want it to be perceived that things like the militarization of space or the debris problem in outer space, like, these are not science fictional things. These are very real and serious issues that as a society we need to deal with. And in terms of perception, the other thing I find interesting is, we see, particularly in sort of media type television movie science fiction, of what a spaceship ought to look like. It could be like the Millennium Falcon, it could be an X-Wing fighter, it could be the Starship Enterprise. And real spaceships, really don't look like that. And there are obviously very important technical and engineering considerations as to why they're not. But, the perception is kind of interesting that in terms of what people see as advancement, because of like an X-Wing fighter or something, that something like with wings, like the old space shuttle or the X-37B that is pictured on the left there, that something that looks kind of neat and has wings and appendages is more advanced or is futuristic, when in fact a rather stodgy and perhaps boring looking like basic capsule like the SpaceX Dragon makes a lot more sense from a technical and a practical and an engineering standpoint. one of the things that I think is probably familiar to this group that we often hear is the notion of science fiction predicting, the quotation marks, predicting the future. And in terms of, at least as it relates to the real life exploration of space, I would argue that it's kind of hit and miss in a way. Um, I like to say that, a lot of science fiction, I believe, does quotation marks, predict or have ideas about, what may be to come. And they're generally accurate in sort of the big picture and the aggregate, but, perhaps misses some of the details. So I'm sure everybody in this, this group remembers, back 15 years ago when the Chinese ship Xian landed on Europa, one of the moons of Jupiter, and was subsequently attacked and destroyed by some kind of alien creature. And of course, obviously, I'm joking here. None of those things actually happened, but these were all things that were portrayed in Arthur C. Clarke's novels 2001 and 2010. So, we haven't sent human beings out into the outer solar system yet, but that doesn't mean that we didn't explore. We did explore the outer source and we continue to do so. We've sent spacecraft to every planet in the solar system, even Pluto, for those of you who debate its planetary status. It's just that it was done with robots. It wasn't done with human beings. But nevertheless, it happened. And one could argue that robots are uh, an appropriate or versatile or successful proxy or avatar to a physical human presence out in many of the hostile places in the solar system. One of my other favorite examples of this notion of science fiction sort of predicting things in sort of the big picture, the aggregate, but sort of getting some of the details wrong, are the new technologies that in many cases have been inspired by a lot of the media science fiction. So, there was at one point a Google, sorry, like an X Prize for developing a tricoder. One of the people's favorite examples is, sort of tablet devices, pads, which were, first portrayed in some of the Star Trek series and movies from the 1990s to the early 2000s. So here we have good Captain Picard here with his desk full of pads. And what I find interesting about this is, how many of these devices does one actually need? He's got a desk full of them. And so the interesting thing to me here is that the creators of this correctly envisioned electronic pad type devices, but did not envision the notion of multifunctionality, that you have one phone that is one device that is could be, your tricoder, your computer access, uh, maybe your phaser as well, but although that's probably not such a good idea. So again, I do find this very interesting of sort of getting the big picture right, but perhaps some of the smaller details not so much. And in terms of sort of perception and getting the big picture right and maybe some of the details a bit off, what I also find fascinating about the relationship between science fiction and the real life space program is, if you go back, to like the 30s and 40s, and again, at least in the sort of Western and North American tradition, is this notion of private space exploration, which really came to the fore over the last 15 years with, like SpaceX and Virgin Galactic and Blue Origin and all those things. If you go back, the whole notion of space exploration being a government-led activity, that there would be like a NASA or European Space Agency or Canadian Space Agency, it really wasn't in science fiction. It was all private. It was stuff like, Heinlein's rocket ship Galileo, is somebody's eccentric genius uncle builds a rocket ship in their garage and they go to the moon and they find a Nazi base and they beat them up or something. So in some ways, the sort of the government sort of space program that was catalyzed by the Cold War and the race to the moon in the 60s with the Apollo program, we've kind of gone full circle and gone back to what science fiction has portrayed with the private sector, certainly in a complementary role, if not in some cases a leadership role for the exploration and utilization of space. So I mentioned in that sort of block diagram how science fiction in some ways influences the support, certainly the budgetary type of support and the policies around scientific endeavors and space exploration. So the argument has been made, and this is, coming from a space person like myself, I have to admit this is perhaps painful for me to admit, but from if you're interested in exploration, the interesting fact is that human beings have spent more time on the surface of the moon than they have at the bottom of the ocean. And yet, if you're a biologist, if you're an ecologist, and if you're a geologist, you could argue that the bottom of the ocean is actually a much more interesting place than the surface of the moon. And yet, disproportionately, far more money and effort has been spent in certain aspects of space exploration than there are in terms of oceanographic studies and the study of some of the inaccessible places of our own planet. And there are actually people in the scientific community, in the planetary science community, that argue that science fiction has not only influenced, sort of influence resources to be pulled away from other scientific endeavors towards space, but even in the exploration of space, it skewed things. So there is a huge effort and an ongoing international effort to explore Mars. And this is all wonderful and all valid and all beautiful and scientifically important. But if you were interested in other things, if you're interested in cosmology or another planet like Venus, this might not be to your particular scientific endeavor. And there was a funny story years ago. There's a person named Paul Byrne who is a Venus researcher at North Carolina State University, who was once, I saw in the article, because Dr. Byrne's interest is in the exploration of Venus, and we really haven't explored Venus, since the early 2000s. This person actually semi-jokingly once said that he would love to see like the planet Mars blown up, sort of like Death Star Alderaan style, so that more attention could finally be put on other places in the solar system, like Venus. But I think that would be a very interesting discussion to have, with not only science fiction fans, but people in the scientific community, about how things are prioritized and what influence science fiction might have on those types of, that type of decision making. But I would be remiss in saying that, Dr. Byrne's opinions aside, that, I am actually a Mars lover myself. And I was very privileged in my early career to have worked on an instrument that actually went to Mars on the Phoenix lander in 2007. And the Phoenix lander actually also carried a very special payload, and it was actually an old school DVD that was prepared by the Planetary Society called Visions of Mars. And this was a recording of various works of not only scientific literature, but pieces of art about the planet Mars, presumably including a lot, going back to Rice and Wells and Bradbury. And if you're interested, I would highly recommend a beautiful story called "The Emperor of Mars" by Alan Steele, in which this particular DVD that we sent to Mars is, I'll just say that it's a key plot element of his really wonderful story, the Emperor of Mars. And I'll start wrapping up here with, I started with the title slide of sort of the fictional Starship Enterprise and the prototype Space Shuttle Enterprise from the 1970s. So the sort of intersection between sort of the media portrayal and the real life exploration of space. I just really adored this picture. So this is from 1976. This was the rollout of the prototype Space Shuttle Enterprise from its plant in California. And at the time, the entire crew, sorry, the entire cast rather, of the original American Star Trek was there, with the exception of William Shatner. So there was Gene Roddenberry in some, actually all of them, frankly, in some rather interesting 1970s fashions of the day. But this picture really historically really speaks to me, sort of encapsulating all those things that I talked about over the course of this presentation of how really the real life exploration of space and science fiction are so very, very much intertwined. So I will close with one last bit of shameless self-promotion that if you are interested in some of the things I've talked about, I hope that you might consider checking out some of my science fictional works. So Gloria talked about my collection, Just Like Being There. In terms of the topic of this presentation, people might also be interested in an anthology put out by the European Astrobiology Institute called Life Beyond Us. This is a collection of not only science fiction stories, but scientific essays about astrobiology and the study of life in the universe. So I have the opening story. It's called Hemlock on Mars, and it actually deals with those Viking life detection experiments in the 1970s that I talked about. And I also have a story in an anthology called Brave New Worlds, which concerns the exploration and settlement of extrasolar planets beyond our immediate solar system. And with that, I realize I've hit about 45 minutes. Thank you so much for your interest and your attention today. And I'm thrilled to be here, and let's have a discussion. I'd be happy to take your questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Eric. And, it begins to be, what do they call that, where you start to cross paths and correlate, where, it isn't all separate people you haven't even met before, like you. It turns out you were working on the Phoenix Mars lander, which was controlled from here in Tucson once it was on Mars.
That's right. It was.
Did you come here to see some of that?
I did not, because the way that sort of space missions work, it goes from like phase A to D, where phase D is the operation, and so there were people who did go down to UA. I was not one of them.
Well, I want to tell you something. They had Wednesday open house where kids would come in from schools, and they had 3 big projectors. So we could put they could put live footage from Mars, and it was like Cinerama, the old thing where it kind of it's around you. It was almost like surround vision. And on Wednesdays you could go and you could be on Mars.
It's amazing.
I
I think we
never
have
in my life will I have that experience again, sorry.
Oh, no, I'm sorry to interrupt, Gloria. I'm just seeing, I think there's a raised hand from Matthias.
Oh, is there? Yes, yes. Matthias?
Yeah, thank you so much, Eric. That was a fascinating talk. I love this slide that you showed of Picard with these various sort of pads, right? Essentially like the precursors to iPads in front of him. And what I found interesting, right, was you mentioned, right, how they did the Star Trek creators didn't think that there could be one device sort of to do all the different functions. And they also didn't really think that all of these devices might be networked. Right, and Star Trek often, right, you have the idea that there's sort of one big computer on the starship, rather than, let's say, that you would have, let's say, the Federation computers all being networked with one another. And sort of my question is sort of just about your take on, like in the 1960s, 1970s, right? They promised us, the science fiction writers, they promised us that now in the 21st century we would have lunar colonies, but we would have colonies in Mars and further afield. But a lot of like science fiction writers in the 1960s and 1970s, they could not really see the internet coming, or they couldn't really see sort of all these network devices coming. So I was just wondering what you made of that. Sort of how come they were able to imagine intergalactic, or interstellar flight, but not the internet.
Matthias, I think you raised some very good points, and that's actually a new perspective for me. I had not considered, and now that you mention it, yes, that they're always asking the computer, this, that, and the other thing. Even up to like the newer series, like Strange New Worlds, they're still doing that. It's that mainframe type of mentality from the 60s and 70s, and not the distributed computing architecture where we have devices deployed widely in our pockets or wherever else. That's a really wonderful observation. I do think that it speaks to the earlier point I made, where science fiction correctly identifies the generalities, but sort of the details of the deployment and the implementation, might be a bit off. So recognizing that computing is important, robotics is important, artificial intelligence is important, but as you said correctly, the details of a distributed architecture rather than a centralized architecture was kind of missed. In terms of the other half of your question about the sort of Western portrayals in the 50s and 60s, this sort of straight line extrapolation that surely we must have bases on the moon and exploration, crude human exploration to the outer solar system, that didn't quite happen. Is perhaps one of the things, one of the shortcomings is maybe it's because there are too many people like me writing science fiction that have strictly a technological background. And so I think in some cases, people like me could be blindsided that it's not always just technology, that there's economics, there's societal, there's political aspects, there's human interaction aspects that we don't take into account. So it wasn't a technological reason that, for example, the Americans stopped going to the moon. It was political and economic rationales, that because it wasn't about science and exploration per se, it was about a Cold War competition. So when that was won, the political calculus, the political driver was gone. And I think that this begs that we need to have more diversity in writing science fiction. So not just hard science people like me, but there should be lawyers, there should be political scientists, there should be sociologists writing science fiction, so we don't get blindsided by by these things. I think we have a question from Sarah.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you, Eric.
Yeah, thank you very much, Eric. And I'm going to just quickly take this opportunity. Can we get in touch? Can I interview you for my PhD, please?
Oh, I would be honored to do so. Yeah, I think Gloria's got my coordinates, but you can find me on LinkedIn or through my website. Thank you.
Yeah, and I do have those books you mentioned, actually, because I did a panel at Worldcon. Julie Novakova from the Biology Institute was on the panel with me.
Oh, was this Dublin Worldcon?
No, Glasgow.
Glasgow, yes, my goodness, I was there.
Oh, were you? Yeah, my
Yes,
research, I
yeah.
actually did a panel on my research, and Julie was on it, and some other people whose names I can't remember. Megan Christian, the astronaut from ESA, was on the panel as well. Anyway, no, thank you. That was great. I'm absolutely fascinated by how science fiction has influenced people to become scientists. And, is there any special way we can write science fiction to be even more inspirational? Which is the focus of my PhD. I'm writing a short story collection in homage to the Heinlein juveniles.
Julie Novakova would actually be a wonderful person for you to interview as well, if you've not already done so.
I did ask her. We haven't managed to meet up on that.
Wonderful.
But yeah, thank you. Great talk.
Oh, thank you.
if there's a lull here for a second, I had a couple important to me questions. One of which is, you may have partially answered this, and if so, you can just nod and I'll move on because I have another one. The softer genres are growing much faster than hard science fiction, Eric. You know that. If you look at the shelves of the bookstores, horror, fantasy. And to what do you attribute hard science fiction's smaller growth into the readership? Can forums like this help, do you think?
Well, I think forums like this certainly do help. And as to the wider question as to why, you know, perhaps some of the hard science fiction works have, perhaps don't have the center of places they might have done, a few decades ago. Um, I think some of it goes back to my comment, my slide earlier about this sort of general increase in skepticism towards institutions and so-called expertise that has sort of been percolating perhaps since the end of the Second World War. And I think some of that is legitimate. We look at things like the negative outcomes of certain aspects of science, be it militarism or environmental degradation. Some of that is understandable, and then some of it is obviously harmful, as we saw during the start of the pandemic. So I think that is something to be considered, and certainly groups like yours, like Gloria, have a real role in promoting, re-promoting, hard science fiction. And I do believe, to Sarah's point, that it can have a positive influence in, perceptions of science and encouraging people into these careers. I would also argue, though, that there is a positive aspect, and we shouldn't treat the relative displacement of some of the harder science fictions um, that then vis-a-vis decades ago, that if hard SF is part of a wider milieu of speculative fiction that involves more fantasy, more alternate history, things that I'm interested in, some of the softer sciences. I would argue that that's a good thing. There should be a greater diversity of voices and stories and genres and story types, of which I think hard science fiction, should, and I hope would continue to be a part of that diverse mix.
Thank you, Eric. And I just want to put another note about Fred Pohl. And even though this seems forever ago, that one book, that and the Marching Morons, which he also wrote, was terribly critical or wonderfully critical of what was then the big PR industry on Madison Avenue. We need to know that that has only exponentially increased into the social media realm and is even more potent than then. But because most science fiction people do not come from the field of PR and advertising, whereas this one very unusually did. And so The Space Merchants is well worth reading, I think, even though it's that old. And I'd put a big plug in for it.
Certainly
Okay.
did. I see Starlet's hand is
Yeah,
raised.
Starlet?
Raised rather.
Yes, please.
Hi. I want to make kind of like a comment and see your take on it. I know that we've been talking about how hard science can get some things wrong in predicting the future. But I think that science fiction, the main purpose of it is to open the minds of humans and to let us dream in different ways that are outside of the box. So if everything was so predictable, there wouldn't be much fiction in it. Because as you have said very well, it's not only about the science part of it, we also have to take into consideration the politics. Is there a war that broke out? Is it a pandemic? There's a million things that can happen in the world that can derail something that seemed to be almost there. And who knows how long it will take for someone else to decide to, okay, let's try this once again. But I really think that we don't really know everything. And the same way that we couldn't predict through science the internet, we also have not been, we haven't predicted many other things. And I think that's kind of beautiful because it shows that humans are not predictable and that we can surprise ourselves, not just by doing bad things, we can also do creative things and good things. And I think that I don't know how you guys feel about this, and I would like to know your take on that is having the possibility of thinking outside of the box. So maybe the engines of the spacecraft is going to be out there, or the shape of it, or the material, but it's just giving an opportunity to see things in a different way.
I
So
very much
that
agree
was
with this. Oh, yeah, go ahead, Eric.
no, I actually have literally nothing further to say to that. I think Starlet has just expressed that so well, far better than I could. Thank you.
Could I answer that with an artwork that I did? I don't know if you could see that yet. Can you see it? You can also click on it if it's too small. And that's Girl and Her Mars. Now, I grew up in a steel mill and refinery town, and all I saw when I was growing up around me was all this industrial landscape. And because of that, as I've got old enough to read Ray Bradbury and others, you can see I'm envisioning, this is a digital art I did. I'm envisioning the domes, on Mars, of the fictional Mars, and making them from the refinery surroundings. People like me are not supposed to be creative, people who grow up not in the country, not in the pristine nature. But I found a lot of inspiration just riding the bus, going past these industries, which we know all the negatives about. But if you're young and a kid and you don't know all that, but you're starting to read science fiction, that was me. And it's called Girl and Her Mars. So
Um,
I so much agree with you. If I didn't have my Mars, I would only have my steel mills.
Gloria, I think you need to share the image.
It's in chat. Oh, I can share it.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, no, I can share it if I can get it up. I don't know how to get it up. If you can go into chat.
Well, I think I might be able to do it. How's
Can you do
this?
that?
It's
Okay, there
beautiful.
it is. So you can see in the back are the industries, the reality of it. And there's this girl being blown away. It's like there's a breeze blowing her back. And she's seeing what used to be the refinery tanks, but now have become dome cities on Mars. So I wanted to get that message out, and the only way I could do it briefly was to make an art piece of it, just to show how much science fiction could mean, not for people where they have a nice, all nature around them, but for people in the cities, in the grubbiest part, you really can, I don't know how to explain how much science fiction meant to me, but I guess you get it, not to beat a dead horse here. Okay, thank you, Eric.
I love it, Gloria.
I love this. This is so beautiful.
Well, you're welcome to use it and have it if it ever comes in handy to illustrate what science fiction can mean to a young person.
Well, Rory, you know what would be really neat is maybe the group could have some kind of a writing contest where we encourage people to write maybe like a flash fiction or something based on your work, this image.
Wow. Well, yeah, sure. We could maybe discuss that. Yeah, we've never done anything except have these meetings, but sure. And then I'll put out the boost for 25 bucks. You can boost your YouTube channel too. And it does seem to work. Eric, I have one other, what I have you here is a captive speaker. That's a terrible term, captive speaker. I have one other request, and maybe you won't have an answer now, but because you're up there in Canada, do you know any science fiction artists or astronomical artists up in Canada that we might possibly get as a speaker? And you can.
Oh, yes, absolutely. So, this person's name is Bettina Forget. So she is based in Montreal, Canada, but she is actually the director of the artist in resident program at the SETI Institute. And so I'm just trying to find the link here. And there's actually an email address for her as well. I'm just going to put this in the chat, Gloria.
Oh, thank you very much.
Yeah.
And that ties in with my repeated off mentioned, I don't know if I mentioned it to you, but we have a hard time getting artists, and we want to have artists, but they are only like about every 10 months or every once a year we get an artist. So I have to remember more to try to get artists, because next month one of these rare people is coming, Simon Krieger, Kregar, Krieger. He's one of the foremost astronomical painters who goes to a lot of science fiction art shows. And you're nodding, Eric, maybe you've even heard of Simon Krieger. And so we're fortunate. That's good. Then that's a testimonial. He is someone we've heard of. And he's gonna come next month.
That's wonderful. I would encourage you to reach out to Bettina as well.
I will, because even rarer than artists are women artists.
Yeah. So she's actually also an amateur astronomer. She was the past president of the Montreal chapter of the Royal Astronomical Society of Canada. And she's currently doing PhD research on the intersection of science, space, astronomy, science fiction, and feminism. And she has, if you want to Google this, she has a very interesting project called Women with Impact. And it makes the point that out of about 1,500 named craters on the moon, only 32 of them are named for women. And so she's actually done this display, a profile of the 32 lunar objects that are actually like recognizing women.
Wow, and that's very important to note. This is directed also at Matthias, that until we got Farouk, I can't think of Farouk's last name, from Egypt as the nomenclature head for NASA, nothing was being named after the Arabic medieval astronomers and all of those, the huge history of astronomy in the Mideast. But when we got Farouk, I can't think of his last name, but anyway, when we got Farouk, things started to be named after the Middle Eastern of the medieval period, but also maybe more recent ones too. But we just didn't represent.
Are you referring to Dr. Farouk Elbaz?
Dr. Farouk Elbaz, that's his name, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
So he was one of the geologists who trained a lot of the Apollo astronauts. And just as a science fictional aside, I believe in season 2 of Star Trek: The Next Generation, there was a shuttle pod named for Farouk Elbaz.
Oh, that's good. Things are beginning to open up, and dissemination of information is also a part of science, as well as linguistics and language studies. And you can see that principle of the Ames, this is a couple from the 1950s called The Powers of 10. I don't know if you ever saw that film, Eric. It's called The Powers of 10.
There was like a person like lying on a park in Chicago and you sort of pull out
Yes.
and then it's like
And
1 meter, 10 meters, 100 meters. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
I adapt that to show dissemination of information. So if that park, you get 24/7 coverage of things and awareness of figures of history and everything. As you do powers of 10 away from it, it gets more and more sketchy. So it isn't all just bias against other places and people who aren't us. It's that dissemination of information means you start where you are, and through those powers of 10 distances, it's more and more sparse, more and more sketchy. And so it took a while to get back and catch up with not NASA's and, where it is and JPL, but finally they realized, oh, over there, and it came through someone from there. These are important points that he came from another place. So his circles all started from Egypt. Farouk Elbaz. Dissemination of information. I don't know if anybody's going to write a science fiction on how that might factor in, but it's very important. Okay, any other observations? They don't have to be questions or thank yous and how wonderful this was, because it really was. And otherwise, yes, Starlet.
On what you were saying about the importance of dissemination of information, that's how we got Renaissance. Because in medieval times, the Greek knowledge was lost of the first philosophers. And then through Spain, you had the Arabs actually kept that knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
And it was translated by Jewish people. And that's how it came into what was the Western world back again into it. And that's how those translations got into, the people of Spain. And from there, it went to the rest of Europe. And we got back Thales of Mileto and all the Socrates and Plato and everything that had been lost and all that science, the beginning of science, which came into the hands of Copernicus and Galileo, and it changed the world.
It is, and I just saw, although it came out years ago, it's called The Name of the Rose by Umberto Eco, I think.
Yes.
And not only was it lost, but they were like going after people that could read Greek, or that's a Greek book. It was like something that was by Karl Marx, or oh, that's in Greek. No, we'll have to find that, put that person on fire, burn them because they're reading. So it wasn't just lost, but once they realized it went around the current authority hierarchy, they saw Greek text as dangerous. That was one thing. I didn't realize how pervasive that may have been.
Indeed. So I completely agree with you on the dissemination of information.
Oh yeah, and maybe it's because I come from that other background with language studies, and you begin to see that, the different discourse communities of different languages and so on. Anyway, so keep that one in mind. And Umberto Eco's The Name of the Rose really makes that point very clearly and kind of violently at times about how not only was this knowledge starting to come back, but it was fought against at that time. So thank you all, and thank you, Starlet. You've come in with some really unusual and welcomed insights here. And thank you, Eric. And I guess now I'll let us go so that I can go and save the file and we can publish it on YouTube. So any other final words, Eric?
Except for two, thank you.
Okay, well, we'll see y'all next time, hopefully, and have a very good weekend.
Thank you so much, everybody. Have a good weekend.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you.